Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you the embroidery stitch called the leaf stitch. Now this is a beautiful stitch. It creates the veining of a leaf. I tend to think of it as the skeleton leaf stitch because it just creates the interior of the leaf. I add a stem. Now you could always add a perimeter to really fill in the leaf, and it makes a beautiful profile. There are many variations depending on the thickness of the thread you use, the number of strands of embroidery floss, or if you use pearl thread, and how you space your stitches. So let me show you how I do it, and just some ways that I use this stitch.
So the leaf stitch is a very interesting stitch. I think it looks more like a skeleton leaf stitch because you actually see the veining pretty well throughout the piece. It's a really beautiful stitch. It's kind of intricate. It almost looks like a woven braid. And I think there's a lot of possibilities for it. Let me show you how to do it. I find a couple of things to remember that make it key and very easy to commit to memory. So to make a leaf stitch, you're going to want to have a leaf shape. And that's kind of like a teardrop shape. So I'm just using a heat erasable pen here, and I'm just sketching a little teardrop shape. And here will be the stem of my leaf. I'll use a different stitch to make the stem, so stems are optional. Now to make this stitch really come to life and really be easy to make, you're going to want to make a small little leaf within the leaf. And you consider this your vein. So I just make a little leaf like this within my leaf. So I'm going to start here. We have 4 lines. The outside, inside 1, inside 2, and then the outside. So 1 and 4 are our outsides. 2 and 3 are our insides. We're going to start the stitch right here at this intersection, but it's actually line 2 that we're going to start at. So I'm going to come up here with some knotted thread right on that intersection. And now I want to make sure I go from inside to outside. So I'm going to skip line 2 and go right to my outside line, line 4. So inside to outside. And you can decide how far up you want your leaf to go to make the angles. I'm just making a slight little angle, and I stitch down. Now you want to come up on the inside, so we're going to come up here. I'm going to move my thread just so you can see it, but I want to come up on line 3, very close to where I went down for line 2. And I'm going to stitch to the outside, and I'm keeping it fairly even to my first outside stitch. So now I'm stitching to line 1 right on the outside. So now again I want to keep this loop loose. I'm going to come up here at line 2 just above the first line that I stitched, my first stitch. So I'm coming up to the inside, and now I'm going to go to the outside. And now when I stitch it, just for ease, I'm not going to stitch that entire loop. So now I'm going to stitch it, but I'm not going to pull it taut. I'm going to flip my loop up and come in on line 3, the inside, and stitch to the outside. And when I catch that loop, when I actually finally do pull it, it starts to create the inner vein. So I'll do the same thing here. I make my loop, I flip it up, and I stitch to the inside. And again, I'm matching all my inside stitches, the approximate height. And now I'm going to stitch to the outside. Make my loop, flip it up, inside, pull it down, pull it snug to the outside, lining it up, make my loop, flip it up, and so on. And I'll continue this process. I'll speed this along so you can see me finishing the leaf, and we'll talk about finishing it off when it's done. You can vary how tight you make your stitches, resulting in a wider skeleton or a much tighter one. The key is just to keep all your inside stitches the approximate same height. So now as I get closer to the top of my leaf, that inner leaf that I sketched gets smaller and smaller. So I just have to keep that in mind. I'm still going to do the same stitches and the same placement, it just gets a little tighter to work with. But it results in a beautiful skeleton leaf when you're done. So now when I've finished my last stitch, you're left with a little bit of an open space over here. I like to start from the top, right at the tip of my leaf, and just pull down a stitch. And that finishes the leaf. To make a stem, I'll just bring my thread. I might even do a stitch in between here if I wanted, but I'm just going to come up here from the base, very close to where I started my stitching, and I'm going to stitch a split stitch. So I stitch one stitch, I come up through it, and I'll stitch as many stitches as that length of stem allows. And when I'm done, I'll just knot it on the back. So now to finish my leaf, I want to get rid of that ink. So I'll just take a hot iron and press it right onto that leaf. And you can see a beautiful leaf here. You can see why I say it resembles the skeleton leaf. Now I use 6 strands of embroidery floss to create this leaf. The leaf itself is a couple of inches long, so I think that's appropriate. I also use 6 strands for these smaller leaves here because I really wanted to have a tight fit. It produces a very beautiful result, and I love that little raised center, that little vein. I think it's pretty effective to use on an actual leaf shape. This happens to be some fabric that had leaves, but I could have just cut out a teardrop shape just as easily. But to me, the most impressive part of this stitch is when you use fewer threads. This is just 2 strands of embroidery floss. You get such a delicate look. It's very lacy and open and beautiful. I could also make my stitches closer together, and it would produce an even more intricate result. So that's the leaf stitch. I think it's a very beautiful stitch to use in your work.
So that's how I create the leaf stitch. I think it's beautiful. I think if you use just a few strands or even 1 strand of embroidery floss, it becomes almost lace-like. It's so light and airy and very delicate. If you use all 6 strands of embroidery floss, it's a little more chunky and it gives a beautiful definition. And in my example, I used the same color embroidery floss as was the fabric leaf. And so it was just a slight variation in what you were seeing. You just saw texture. I loved that effect. I think there's many things you can do with this technique. Again, incorporating leaves into your work. It's just a beautiful stitch that really brings a lot of texture and elegance to your stitching. I hope you found this useful, that you can use in your slow stitching pieces, or even just to add a little embroidery to your work. Thanks for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And please consider becoming a paid member of my channel. There's behind the scenes footage, additional techniques, and access to a library for members only. Thanks for joining me today.